Hi, I'm Dave March, and this is the Spy Guys channel, and I'm meeting with my friend Mark, and we're going to talk about D-Day at the movies. Sorry, no, Pearl Harbor at
Pearl
the movies.
Harbor in the
We did
movies.
D-Day last time. Yeah, so I've looked up a few movies. I only discovered one movie about an hour and a half ago on Pearl Harbor, but and it's the 1943 John Ford movie propaganda film, which seemed to have a lot of inaccuracies, but from what I could tell.
Well, they didn't have a whole bunch of knowledge of the Japanese side at that time.
Correct.
So,
But it was also interesting to watch it for just, they were like really hyping up the idea that the Japanese had all this insider knowledge because of they had all the population was so hostile to the Americans present and all their infiltrators. And of course, I believe almost none of that happened. I don't even think they really had that much spies. And
no, there was one German spy there,
Hmm.
but his reports never got to the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
So,
The one that I have heard stories is that November 40, when the British attacked Toronto, the military attache for the Japanese in Italy at the time ends up also being transferred about 6 months later to Pearl Harbor.
I think you're right. I do know the Japanese did have an active intelligence operation in Pearl Harbor out of the consulate there.
Mm-hmm.
But that was par for the course. Everyone
everyone
did
did.
that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did the same thing in Japan. They just did a better job of keeping us bottled up.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very easy when you look very different from anyone else. Though my father's friend in university, a guy named Klaus Fleisch, I have his book around here somewhere. I haven't read it yet, but he ended up being the son. His father was a German composer in Japan in the 40s, so he was attached to the consulate, and that's where they in the embassy. And in one day, he's on, like, there's almost no other white guys in Japan in the 1940s. And one day he's on a bus and he meets up with sees another white guy on the bus, and they start talking. Guess who he just happened to run into and make friends with? It's a certain reporter.
Richard Sorge.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been fairly early on in the 1940s because they did catch Sorge.
Yeah. And apparently he was arrested. My father's friend was arrested, and has this, like, one of those weird life stories. So he gets arrested for being a known associate of Richard Sorge and is being tried. And I guess the last part of Japan that was still based on the old Meiji Rang that hadn't been taken over by the military authorities was the judiciary. So he's arrested, he's brought into trial, he's put on trial. They get a preliminary hearing in, and then suddenly he's in jail and he hears all these sirens coming across the area, and Doolittle's bombing raid comes through and bombs a bunch of random stuff. Turns out one of the things they bomb is the evidence selection for the police. So when he gets hauled down for his trial, the police are like, so we want to, we're the secret police are like, we don't have any evidence, Your Honor. And it's like, well, if you don't have any evidence, we're going to have to let him go. So they let him go. Case dismissed because Doolittle bombed all the evidence.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's always interesting to hear these kind of weird stories about that kind of, like, coincidences. But I mean, we're here to talk about different movies at Pearl Harbor. I guess we're all going to ignore the really awful movie called Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that, I'm not sure you could call it a pot boiler because the pot would have gone completely dry. And I think that one was done in the era of political correctness.
Well, yeah, it is in a little bit of that time, early 2000s era, when the political
Right.
correctness is on the first era of political correctness is on its wane, but it's more just like it's just like a bunch of guys drive out to the airfield. They get machine gunned by Japanese planes attacking the airfield. They fly off to fight them. They shoot down like 20 planes. I'm like, I think there's like 4 American planes that shoot down. Sorry, two, maybe 4 kills, or no, 7 kills on the entire invasion
Right.
force, and it's almost all ACAC fire.
There were several P-40s that did get off the ground. Plus, you had a whole bunch of Dauntlesses that flew in
Mm.
right in the middle of right after the attack, and a lot of them ended up getting shot down by our own people.
Oh wow, I didn't know about that.
Right. The Dauntlesses flew off the Enterprise as it was approaching Pearl Harbor,
Mm.
and they were supposed to land on Ford Field, which is where the Navy airfield was on Ford Island. And as they approached, they had their landing lights on. The tower knew they were U.S. aircraft, and they were beginning to come in for final when somebody on one of the ships started firing at them, and then pretty soon every ship started firing at them, and half of them got shot down.
Oh wow.
So those were the first casualties that the Big E suffered during World War II.
Wow.
So it was a interesting attack. From a tactical standpoint, it was certainly successful, although not nearly as successful as the Japanese had hoped. The commanding general or commanding admiral of the fleet, Nagumo, refused to go back for a third wave attack. Had he done that, he probably would have lost, probably a quarter of the aircraft committed to that, because by that time, U.S. anti-aircraft and air defense was fully alerted. However, since they missed the tank farm, they really that was the target for the third wave, one of the prime targets for the third wave. Had they done that, that would have crippled the U.S. fleet. One thing most people don't realize is the biggest reason why the battleships that survived stayed on the West Coast was there just wasn't enough fuel for all the ships. So they did not, they kept them out. These were the old battleships, the ones built prior to the Naval Limitations Treaty. And although the U.S. had 4 or 5 battleships knocked out, they had more than enough left over to outnumber the Japanese. But they still kept them all on the West Coast because we realized after Pearl Harbor that the main fighting force was going to be the aircraft carrier. And those battleships didn't come out to play until 1943, when they were being used for shore bombardment for the invasions. So, the biggest thing the Japanese missed at Pearl Harbor were the 3 carriers, which had all been delayed heading back to Pearl Harbor. They were supposed to have been there Saturday night, but bad weather slowed them down. They had been sent out to carry aircraft to different U.S. possessions, Midway, Wake, and I believe Johnston Island, although I might be wrong about that one. The Wildcats, they landed at Wake Island, were the main reason why the first Japanese attack on Wake Island failed.
Okay.
So, because they came in, the aircraft shot up both the transports and the destroyers. And the Japanese, their destroyers had really, really lousy anti-aircraft. The main guns were supposed to have been dual purpose, but they had bagged ammunition. Okay. For those that don't know, you can typically, with guns smaller than 6 inches, 5-inch and smaller, the shell and the bursting or the propelling charge are in a unitary setup, kind of like a cartridge for a rifle bullet. The older way of doing it was to put in the shell and then put in an ammunition bag under after it. And that's what the Japanese had for their 5-inch guns, because they were optimized for surface combat. In fact, that Japanese destroyer was the world's greatest surface ship killer, but they only had 4 anti-aircraft guns on one of those ships, 2 30 caliber machine guns and 2 20 millimeter cannon. So, which is strange when you consider what the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor. Right. You'd think if anyone knew the importance of air defense, it would be the Japanese.
They just seem to have some cultural differences that made them unaware of things. Like certainly Japanese submarine doctrine makes you kind of scratch your head when you read about it.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is the Japanese submarines had what was probably the appropriate doctrine, which was use your submarines against other warships, because aircraft made using them against merchant ships deadly. The only problem was, and that was also the reason the Germans never built a large U-boat fleet prior to World War II, is because they thought the U-boats would end up getting hunted down by aircraft guarding convoys. Except the British never bothered building any aircraft that could attack U-boats. The only reason the U.S. submarine offensive worked as well as it did was because the Japanese didn't believe in defensive use of aircraft, so they never developed a strong anti-submarine aircraft until too late in the war for it to matter. The basic problem with the Japanese is that they believed that the best defense was a strong offense. You're right in that it was cultural, but basically the belief was if you hit your opponent hard enough and if you hit him first and you hit him hard enough, it didn't matter how weak your defense was because he wasn't going to get up off the floor and hit you. And really, if you think about it, that's what Pearl Harbor was all about.
Correct.
The idea was you'd knock out the American fleet, which would then allow the Japanese to attack everywhere in the Pacific. And then the idea was they were going to set up a defensive perimeter that ran roughly from Wake Island, actually the Aleutians to the north, then Wake, then the Gilbert Islands, and then as you move east from there, or west from there, New Britain and New Ireland, and then the northern part of New Guinea, north of the Owen Stanley Mountains. And then they were going to fortify there and let the Allies exhaust themselves trying to get through that. The only problem was they never bothered fortifying those bases. Instead, having achieved all of their victories in the first 6 months, they decided to expand their perimeter and moved out to Midway Island and the Solomons and possibly Australia. the interesting thing about that is Japan had been tied down fighting China since 1937 and were about as successful as the Germans were with the Russians in 1941-42.
Hmm.
They kept winning all the battles, and the Chinese kept fighting on, and Japan couldn't occupy all of China. And now they're going to go and declare war on the United States, Australia, Britain, and the Netherlands, which kind of sounds like compounding their problems.
It does, doesn't it? I was once asked how could Japan win World War II, and I came up with a novel solution, and someone said, "Thank God you weren't on the Imperial General Staff in 1941." My solution was declare war on Germany. Ask the British to intercede with your troubles in China, help you get to pull back out of being caught in this offensive war, and agree to send help to the British in the Middle East. And you get all your territorial and oil objectives out of that.
Well, they did declare war on Germany in World War I, but they grabbed everything that was convenient.
Yeah, and if they had been a bit more aggressive, I think if they had sent troops into Iraq to help the British out, they would have gotten territorial concessions in the Middle East with
possibly oil. But remember that Iraq was essentially a British colony at that time.
Oh, I know, but they could have
protectorate. But
I'm sure they could have made some sort of they would have had a thing at the table, a seat at the table to get more, but they didn't. They weren't thinking that way at that time.
Iran might have been a better bet because Iran was actively hostile to England, and in fact, that you know the reason why it's Iran now instead of Persia. They renamed it in the 1930s because Iran comes from Aryan, and they wanted to stress their similarities with the Nazis.
Oh, really?
Well, they were another Aryan race, right?
Oh, of course. I knew that.
So
I didn't realize that Iran was Aryan. I've met some Persian people, and they were like, "It's just that's not the real name of where we are. It's just kind of a name of the country." I was like, "Oh, okay." I didn't realize it was the word for Aryan. Have you ever heard about the attempt to kill the Big Three at Tehran?
No.
There's a good article in one of the early World at Wars that covers it, and it's a little off topic from the Pearl Harbor, but just the fact that these there was like an SS squad managed to, almost all of them are taken out by the British almost immediately, and then one squad is just trying to get to kill the Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, and it's just so when I read it, I was like, I can't believe this is a movie, and if you made it a movie, no one would believe it.
Yeah. The interesting thing about Pearl Harbor, it was, first off, it was the largest aircraft carrier strike to date. And at that time, only the Japanese were operating 5 and 6 carriers at a time.
Right.
Although even that, prior to Pearl Harbor, they generally operated with just 4 as a maximum.
I think only one other power would have been able to do it, and they just wouldn't be. The British just couldn't afford to concentrate all their carriers in one place.
Well, the problem with the British wasn't the aircraft carriers, it was the aircraft. They never had enough naval aircraft, largely because the Ministry of Air Production prioritized the RAF heavy bombers over naval aircraft. And for example, at Taranto, the reason they used 1 carrier was they didn't have any extra aircraft. They used about a quarter of the Swordfish in the entire Royal Navy inventory for the Taranto raid. So they always had a shortage of aircraft. And if you look at the aircraft numbers, you'd be surprised to see a carrier like Eagle routinely sailed with less than a dozen aircraft
Right.
because it didn't have any more, not because it couldn't take any more.
Okay. That's a
The Japanese had large carrier groups. The big problem they had was they had no means of quickly replacing pilots. They had no problem producing enough aircraft, but the carrier pilots were an elite prior to the war and required years of training. And once the war started, they refused to lower their standards. I think the typical Japanese pilot had 700 hours of flying experience before being committed to combat prior to World War II. By 45, that was down to 200 hours. And some of the kamikaze pilots only had 30 hours training.
Right.
So meanwhile, the United States pilots had 300 hours of training throughout the war. And the United States also rotated its best pilots back to serve as training pilots, whether they liked it or not.
Right. The Canadians and the British did the same, as I recall.
Right.
I remember reading an article about like Japanese fighter pilot training before World War II. And it was one of the surviving pilots. And I think he's one of the guys who was at Pearl Harbor, actually. And he was talking about, I don't understand why I was required to pluck flies out of the air with chopsticks in order to get qualified, but it was something we had to do.
Had to do what?
Pluck flies out of the air with chopsticks.
Okay. It was to demonstrate their dexterity, but as he points out, it's not necessarily relevant to flying an airplane.
Right.
So, and the Japanese airplanes, again, were optimized for attack. Many pilots would remove the radio because on the grounds that the weight of the radio reduced the performance of the airplane. Ditto armor, they didn't even want self-sealing gasoline tanks because the rubber that was used for that added to the weight of the airplane. So again, it's that philosophy that if you hit them first and hit them hard enough, they don't get a chance to hit you. But what that meant was that if a Zero encountered a Wildcat, the Wildcat could absorb the damage that the Zero did and then turn around and return the favor, and the Zero couldn't.
Right.
So
yeah, I've heard that's been an issue with Zeros, that they were like at the end of their design phase, they kind of peaked in 41, 42, and then they had to do a whole new redesign, and that was going to take them years. So they only had the newest, better aircraft that were coming in 45, whereas you have all the P series is just getting better.
Right. Well, the Zero was so good in 1942 that the Japanese decided to hold off replacing it because replacing an airplane is expensive. And that's money that you could spend buying more fighting airplanes rather than developing a new one. They did replace their dive bomber, but they had problems with the new design, and that one never worked out. So that's why you had those fixed wing Ahia valves, the Allies called them valves, operating till nearly the end of the war, because it took them that long before their replacement dive bomber came along. Now, British had the same problem with several of their designs, particularly with the um, Coastal Command aircraft. Their replacement for their biplane flying boats was had a problem with lateral control, and it couldn't fly straight and level on one engine.
Oh, okay.
So there you are on patrol hundreds of miles from the coast, you lose an engine, and you're stuck in ever descending circles. So developing an airplane isn't easy. The main reason the United States had so many good aircraft during World War II was because they designed a lot of bad ones too, except the bad ones never saw production. You know, they're just curiosities. Gee, the XP-75 Ascender, you know, unless you're a real aircraft freak, you've never heard of that. So, and
yeah, I mean, it took a while to get to the Lancaster after what, the Sterlings, and I can't even remember what the other one.
Well, the Sterling was really, the Lancaster was a 4-engine Sterling. The Sterling had a very good airframe, but the Vulture engines that they were using never worked out. They were a supersized engine, rather like the engines on the Henkel 177.
Okay.
And they had similar problems. They overheated. They never produced as much power as they were supposed to.
Yeah, I knew the power was a problem.
They kept breaking down. When they essentially replaced the 2 Vulture engines with 4 Merlin engines. And that was a bit of a gamble because the Merlins were being used for just about everything. Right. I mean, they were being used for their fighters, the Mosquito Bomber. So now you're committing them to a 4-engine bomber, but that was the main focus of bombing command. So that was one reason they did it. The United States ended up with several dud bombers. You know, most notably the B-18 and the B-23.
Okay.
The B-18 was a militarized version of the DC-2. And the B-23 was a militarized version of the DC-3.
Oh, okay.
So, and you know, the Army Air Force tried to get 2 of each type of aircraft. So you ended up with the B-24 and the B-17 for the heavy bombers, the B-26 and the B-25 medium bombers, and so forth.
Well, maybe we should talk about some of these movies. I mean, like, we can talk about the most accurate one of them all. I think it's still Tora, Tora, Tora. But I wouldn't mind hearing your thoughts on In Harm's Way, which is a movie I don't think many people are quite as aware of. Though even
that's an old John Wayne movie.
Yeah,
and
actually Preminger, by the way.
Right. And Pearl Harbor is in there, but it's not really the focus of the movie. That movie focuses on really the Solomons campaign. And they have the Yamato, or a stand-in for the Yamato.
I think it's the Musashi they had the other one show up.
Right. And of course, the Japanese never committed those 2 battleships in the Solomons, basically because they didn't want to risk their 2 premier battleships in the restricted waters of the Solomon Islands.
They don't want to have what they did to the British happen to them.
Right, pretty much. Although I'm not sure if we could have done the same thing. One of the things the Japanese did as a result of the Washington Treaty that limited the amount of ships they could build was they substituted long-range twin-engine bombers that were designed to operate as torpedo planes. And that was supposed to be a substitute for their destroyers. And that's what took out the Prince of Wales and the Repulse.
Those are Betty. They were taken out by Betty's?
Yep. G4M Mitsubishi, we call them Betty's because of the, shall we say, the rounded shape of the engines, and actually the plane. It was shaped kind of like the fuselage was shaped like a Cuban cigar.
Okay.
So, but those were very effective, and the last few U.S. ships that ended up getting hit by Japanese ships were, other than the kamikazes, were primarily the ones that were being hit by the Bettys at night. The cruiser Chicago was actually sunk by torpedo planes in 1943. So those were very effective. The problem was they weren't effective around fighters. They were proved very vulnerable to U.S. fighters. And once the United States Navy started flying night fighters off of their carriers, that ended that threat.
Mm-hmm.
So, the best movie about Pearl Harbor is Tora, 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 Tora.
Mm-hmm.
Very accurate. It gave a tremendous gift to what's now called the Commemorative Air Force, because they converted a whole bunch of trainers to look like Japanese aircraft. I think they turned BT-19s to look like Japanese Kate torpedo, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. They converted a whole bunch of T-6 Texan trainers to look like Zeros. That was something that was done in World War II. When they needed a Japanese fighter, they would take the Texan, paint it gray, put meatballs on it, and have it fight whatever the U.S. Aircraft in the war movie was. They looked very similar. So, and they also built large-scale models of the Japanese warships that bombed Pearl Harbor. Spent thousands of dollars on these ships, and they were when you're talking big scale, we're talking like 1/12 scale. So they were larger than a lot of cruising yachts.
Mm-hmm.
And they ended up selling them as surplus after the movie was over.
Well, yeah, I own several copies of that movie. I got an electronic copy, and I got one on DVD, and it is goes back to that old era up until I think it's only in the late 70s that they finally decide that they don't want to have long movies anymore with the intermissions. And yeah, it definitely has it. So in my electronic copy, I have to fast forward about 20 minutes through the intermission.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's gives you what I most appreciated gave you kind of both sides perspective on things, and you have all the kind of lead up to things. Do you think Kimmel and Short got shorted by history, or do you think that they should have taken some steps themselves to prevent some of the tragedy?
It's hard to say. The problem that we have is everything is obvious in retrospect.
Mhm.
And we had been wargaming, the United States Navy had been wargaming attacks on Pearl Harbor throughout the 30s.
Mhm.
The thing is, though, nobody took it seriously because if you think about it, um, Japan was taking a real risk by attacking that far away from the Japanese home islands.
Mhm.
Um, there had been no fleet that sailed unsupported that distance prior to Pearl Harbor. And even during World War II, with the exception of the Doolittle Raid, no American fleet operated that far from a base of operations.
Mhm.
Um, with the first U.S. Uh, offensives in the Pacific, you were only going half the distance. And we could always, at worst case, we could fall back on Midway Island. The Japanese had to sail across some of the worst parts of the North Pacific Ocean, refuel at sea, um, just to get to Pearl Harbor, and then they had to refuel on the way back.
Mhm.
And there was a real concern that their ships might run out of fuel coming home because of the technical difficulty of trying to refuel in the North Pacific.
Mhm.
Those are gambles that normally admirals don't like to take with their ships.
Mhm.
Um, and you needed some very extraordinary incentives to do that. Again, the analogy would be the Doolittle Raid,
Yeah.
where we took half of the carriers that we had in the Pacific and sailed them. The idea was we were going to get to within 500 miles of the Japanese home islands
Mhm.
before launching the B-25s. But they were a long, long way from any harbor,
Mhm.
and had those ships taken damage, they would have had to have been scuttled to prevent them from being captured.
Mhm.
Japanese faced the same thing. Now, did Short and Kimmel ignore some of the warnings? Yeah, but if you think about it, MacArthur did too,
Of
and
course, I'm not
he
giving.
didn't get punished at all. In fact, he has a whole lot less excuse
Mhm.
because Clark Field happens some 12 hours after Pearl Harbor,
Mhm.
and the Japanese
Well,
still
you got to
manage.
understand, he's got his Bible from his wife, and he's going to be praying for the next little while.
So, but the thing is that Short was focused on sabotage, which is the reason that he had all of the fighters clustered together.
Mhm.
And um, the part of the problem was nobody really appreciated radar at that time. It was brand new, and in fact, the radar set in Pearl Harbor was pretty much experimental.
Mhm.
They were using it, but they were using it as much as a training tool as they were operationally.
Mhm.
Um, you know, the there was an incident reported where Kimmel was standing at a window when a bullet came through, broke the window, and hit him in the chest. It had
Mhm.
been uh, pretty much spent, so it just bounced off him without injuring him.
Mhm.
And his comment at that point was, "It would have been more merciful if it had killed me."
True.
And he ended up as pretty much the scapegoat for it. Um, Short had again a little less excuse, but again, nobody expected it.
Right.
And no, we didn't have warning. We knew the Japanese were going to start a war real soon. And there is some indication that Admiral Hart, who commanded the Asiatic fleet, had sent out a couple of small American ships. They were largely unarmed patrol craft, hoping that the Japanese would attack them to pretty much get the war started prematurely.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I said, the Japanese pulled off an attack that we didn't expect, that really nobody expected. At the time, we thought Pearl Harbor had the water in Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedoes.
Of course, the Japanese, as we learned watching the movie,
Right,
specifically built torpedoes to get beyond that.
right, and they got the idea from Taranto,
Yeah.
which was the British attack on the Italian fleet. What's interesting about that is that attack was a lot more successful than the British had expected.
Right.
If you read about that, you get the feeling it was done more as a distraction than a serious attempt to damage the Italian fleet.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, had they realized, it's like I said, had they realized how effective they would be, they probably would have had more aircraft committed to that.
Yeah. And they also had the problem is that some of the torpedoes used at Taranto are magnetically designed, so they failed to deploy because no one knew in the world that magnetic fields existed around the Earth. So it was working fine in the North Sea, but it wasn't working so well there. Though,
right.
In their defense, after Taranto, they said, "Well, these torpedoes don't work. We'll just get new We'll just go back to the old ones." Unlike, say, the United States, from what I understand, kept using them.
Yeah, well, the U.S. torpedo problem was independent of the experience of the British and Germans. Actually, every nation except Japan had serious problems with their torpedoes when they were first used in combat. One reason is that torpedoes are very expensive. So nobody wanted to live fire test them except the Japanese, who I guess you could think of them as the Oriental version of the good old boys from the South, because
Right.
they loved watching things go boom.
Mm-hmm.
And they did expend their torpedoes against live targets. If some of the ships that were ordered scrapped as a result of the naval limitation treaties ended up being used to test the Long Lance torpedo. And they were also trained under very rigorous circumstances. They actually lost quite a few men in training. That wouldn't have been tolerated in the U.S. Navy or the Royal Navy.
Right.
But the Japanese considered that the price of admiralty. But as I said, the German torpedoes, British torpedoes all failed in 1939. One of the reasons why the Ark Royal survived was the Germans used magnetic exploders on the torpedoes they sent towards her, and they didn't go off.
At Taranto, the bombs proved more effective than the torpedoes.
Actually, some of the torpedoes proved effective as well.
Yeah, they had a mixture of them, as I believe. So the magnetic torpedoes didn't work, but the regular torpedoes did.
Right. And with the United States, the torpedoes were being built at a factory in Rhode Island. And basically, Rhode Island was unique in that it had 2 senators and 1 congressman, and they all viewed their job as seeing that torpedoes were only built in Providence, Rhode Island. And it wasn't until after World War II started, actually after Pearl Harbor, that they opened up a torpedo factory somewhere else. They never tested the torpedoes. The folks that ran the plant, including the workers, thought of the job as a sinecure rather than a serious job. I mean, the purpose of the torpedo factory was to give them jobs. It wasn't to give the U.S. Navy weapons.
Right.
And there was a lot of resistance to the fact that the torpedoes might be misbehaving. It was easier to blame the submariners or the destroyermen that were using the torpedoes than to blame the torpedoes. And they basically said, oh, you guys are using them wrong. And the other problem was, it wasn't one problem, it was multiple problems. Not only was the magnetic exploder not working, the contact exploder wasn't either. If you hit a target square on, the firing pin would crush and not go back and detonate the torpedo warhead. In order to be able to have it explode successfully, you had to hit the ship at an oblique angle. And that wasn't discovered until 1943. And what's interesting is they replaced the firing pins with pins cut out of the toughest metal they could find, which were some of the propellers that had been left over at Pearl Harbor from the shot down Japanese aircraft. So I'm serious, they were milling out the firing pins from Japanese propellers.
Okay.
So,
I also heard there was something about the vice admiral in charge of procurement ended up being, when he was a rear admiral, was in charge of developing some of these torpedoes.
Right.
So,
also, the torpedoes ran deep. That was the third problem they had.
And so when the reports came up to him, and he's like, well, that can't be right. I couldn't have passed the wrong program.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, it's just like, you're on a war footing. There are certain things you should be doing regardless. You should have standing combat air patrol. You should have had the PBYs being used. And the fact that on that Sunday, everyone's at, I get it. The wives were coming down and yelling at Kimmel that, you're making our husbands go out to sea. But the war warnings kept coming in, he needed to really stand firm and tell the wives.
However, they did have PBYs flying.
Oh, okay, good. But
they weren't flying to the north where the Japanese approached, because you'd have to be crazy to come from that direction.
Or Japanese,
but I repeat myself.
Yes.
And they didn't have enough PBYs to have 180-degree coverage either.
Yeah.
There was a shortage of everything but shortages at that time.
Yeah, of course, because everything that really needs to go is going on the East Coast.
No, actually, it was being shuttled to the Philippines.
True enough.
They committed a good 1/3 to 40% of the American aircraft in the Pacific to defend the Philippine Islands.
And of course, everyone sensible would attack.
Well, that made sense because that's where the Japanese were going to attack.
Right.
And the idea was we would blunt their attack. The problem, of course, was that wasn't the only place they attacked. We also grossly underestimated the capability of the Japanese, and the Japanese were more than willing to be misunderestimated. For example, when they would bring foreign observers to watch Japanese naval pilot training, they would have them watch this exercise where the object was to get the pilot to fly as close as possible to a pole. That was, and it looked like you had a bunch of blind pilots almost hitting this pole. The thing is, though, that was the exercise. It was see how close you could get without hitting it.
Right.
but it made them look like these guys don't know what they're doing. So
Yeah, so like I said, some of those, I think there's stuff that needed to be done as soon as they were getting close to that war footing, and they just kept acting like they were in a peacetime when they were on the edge. And hey, that's why I do put some blame on these guys.
Yep.
But yeah, certainly compared to MacArthur, but MacArthur needed to get it. They needed a hero, so they made him the hero.
yeah.
And I at least can say in MacArthur's case, he did do a good job of making up for that with some of the stuff he later did in life, like bypassing truck. And
Well, that wasn't his choice. That was the Navy called that one.
Yeah.
In fact, MacArthur did not want us to go into the Marianas and opposed the U.S. Navy fleet's drive up the Central Pacific. That was sold that it would offer the Japanese a division of forces. They would have to divide between two advances. MacArthur wanted the Pacific Fleet carriers to support his operations in New Guinea.
Right.
Which would not have been a good use of carrier
No,
aircraft.
they were not.
And a lot of the island hopping that he did was forced on him by both superiors and subordinates. He was blessed with one really outstanding commander, which was George Kenny, who commanded the 5th Air Force.
Yeah.
And
I've done my own article on Kenny. So
Kenny was one of those rare people who was both a braggart and yet delivered.
Yeah.
He came up with some really interesting innovations, such as skip bombing. He developed the parafragmentation bomb. They ended up improvising all sorts of weapons to knock out airfields, including wrapping a 500-pound bomb with wire and then putting a 3-foot fuse at the end of it. They literally attached a 3-foot pipe with the fuse at the end of the pipe. That way, when the bomb hit, it exploded 3 feet above the ground and took out a maximum number of aircraft. So, that was one of the reasons why MacArthur succeeded.
Yeah, certainly. What was the Kenny's use of all those aerial gunships to take out like 40 destroyers in one battle? It's like
4. I've actually got a book coming out on that next January. About the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And the gun bomber transformed the bomber from something that was grossly ineffective, the medium bomber from something that was grossly ineffective against ships, into one of the deadliest things that you could attack a ship with. Again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the Japanese destroyers having inadequate anti-aircraft.
When you mentioned that, I was like, well, that explains the Bismarck Straits, but I didn't say it aloud.
Well, there's more than just that. The Japanese had a very good medium light anti-aircraft gun in the 23 millimeter. The problem with it was it had a 17 round clip.
Oh, yeah.
And basically you could fire that thing for 7 seconds and then you had to replace the clip. And what the Japanese gunners would do is they would wait until the aircraft were 7 seconds away from the destroyer to maximize their chance of getting a hit. because they couldn't change the clip out in time fast enough to replace it once they, if an aircraft were approaching and they fired at maximum range, they'd be out of bullets by the time the before the aircraft attacked, and by the time they changed the ammunition, the aircraft would be past them. So they held fire. The only problem with that is that meant that they were firing from about 700 yards out, and those B-25s would open up with their 850 caliber machine guns at 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
So by the time the Japanese were firing, they were being hosed down by 50 caliber rounds. So, you know, the B-25s were essentially attacking without being fired back on.
Right.
And the mast top and skip bombing tactics they used got hits about somewhere between 1/3 to 50% of the time.
Wow.
As I said, it made those bombers absolutely deadly. You had something similar with the American fighters, particularly the Corsairs with the 850 caliber machine guns. And that 50 would penetrate the deck plates of either a destroyer or a cargo ship, and would actually go through a second set of plates, i.e. at the bottom of the ship, unless something stopped it, like an engine, a boiler, an ammunition room. So, and those bullets would actually penetrate that 5-inch, the gun shields of the 5-inch guns that the destroyers had.
Yeah.
So quite interesting. It changed the dynamics. Prior to March of 1943, the Army Air Force hardly sank any Japanese ships. After that, it rivaled the US Navy.
Right.
And those tactics actually were soon adopted by the Navy, which is one reason why you see the Helldivers disappear in 1945, because you could use the Avengers just as effectively, and they were much more flexible aircraft.
True.
But you could do skip bombing with an Avenger just as well as you could with a Helldiver. So,
yeah, it's a shame that Kenny didn't have much of a career after the war, but he ended up taking over SAC for some reason. Bad job for him. And then he went to the academy and then did like a TV series that I've been trying to find.
Yeah. What TV series?
I'd have to look it up, but I mean that was long ago.
Interesting.
Air Command of the Air or something like that. He's on IMDb, so there's it here. He was on something called Flight, and I know he did something else, like, but
he was very definitely unconventional.
Yeah, and I have his copy of his book around here somewhere too.
Yeah. The thing is that the guy that developed those gun B-25s was Paul Gunn, who had been a enlisted Navy pilot in the 1930s. He had been discharged in, I think, 1939, and took a job running an airlines in the Philippines. And then when World War II started, Kenny commissioned him as, no, Kenny did not. Somebody commissioned him as an Air Force officer, essentially running the same airline. And he ended up flying out of the Philippines with a bunch of MacArthur's staff at the very end. And that's when Kenny hooked up with him, and he gave Gunn the job of developing weapons for him.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, Gunn did not have a college degree, which was considered extremely unusual at that time for officers, certainly for one that rose as high as he did. I think he retired as a colonel.
Yeah.
So,
I remember reading this. I was reading a book on Vietnam and Max Sog there, and this guy is like he ends World War II as the youngest light colonel in the United States Army, and he starts Vietnam as the oldest light colonel in the United States Army.
Yeah.
I think Boss Mongo can relate to that. But we're coming down to the end of the show.
Okay.
But I do remember one more Pearl Harbor movie I think we should mention, The Final Countdown.
Science fiction one where you've got the super carrier go back in time.
Yeah, is it the Nimitz or is it the Enterprise? I can't remember which one it is, but it goes back in time, and they capture the Japanese officer, right? They shoot him down. They're like trying to figure out what's going on, and they like guy relates out the entire story of like Pearl Harbor to them, and they have to make the decision whether or not they're going to intervene in history or go home.
I don't know. It would be a tricky thing to go back in time and change history, because you might disappear.
Oh yeah, there is actually a series of science fiction novels. I haven't read them, but I found them once, and it is basically set in like 2025, and they send back stuff into the past, but it turns out it's an alternate timeline, right. So it does not affect them in the here and now, but becomes this arms race in the past during World War II between China and America to control this alternate universe.
Yep. Okay.
Well, we didn't really talk too much about the movies, but we did definitely talk about the stuff that happens, and I think that's more what we are interested in talking about.
Right.
So.
Right.
What movie and battle should we talk about next? I've done the first two suggestions. What would you like to talk about?
Well, I can think of two that would be fun to talk about. One would be Midway.
Yep.
The other one would be to discuss the movie Patton.
Okay. Both of those would be good. And we don't have to necessarily keep it to World War II. We can certainly talk about other things too. Like I keep watching, North and South's Battle of Bull Run footage.
If you want to talk Civil War movies, The Killer Angels.
I don't think I've seen that one.
I think they turned it into the movie Gettysburg.
Okay, yes, then I've seen. Yes, I have seen Gettysburg.
Yeah, it was adopted from a book called The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. Who is Jeff Shara's father. So, and that's actually one of the better Gettysburg movies. In fact, why don't we do that? Let's talk about Gettysburg movies next time.
Yeah, we'll turn it up. So we've done World War II a little bit in the Pacific and Europe, and now we'll go to American Civil War, and we'll be able to cover all sorts of wars now that we've opened it all up. So it's good seeing you again, Mark, and we'll try doing this. We'll get back in maybe another couple weeks.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, bye.
Okay.
Oh yeah, and if you like this stuff, like, share, and subscribe below. Thanks. Bye.